Hello again YouTube, my name's RJ, welcome to my workshop. Today we're going to take a look at the US General 44-inch box again. I've shown this before in an organizational video that I did. I've never done this before, I'll try to put a link up here and give you a link to that video if you haven't seen it. Today we're going to work on organizing one of the drawers. Today's drawer is going to be drawer number 3, the Plier drawer. Several drawers I've already got nicely organized, sockets, things like that, but several drawers are kind of a mess and just kind of scattered in here. I'm going to bring you in closer, show you what I've got right now, show you through my design process, how I work out what I want to do, come up with different ideas. Then I'm going to build it and bring you along, and then hopefully at the end we'll show you the fine, wonderful, organized drawer that hopefully will work well. Okay, so here's the Plier drawer, and you can see it's just simply the pile method. Whatever you grab, you use it. When you're done, toss it back in, close the drawer, you're done. There is some validity to this design. It has worked well for me for a couple of reasons. One, guess which pliers I use the most? It's pretty easy to tell. It's the ones that are on top. Regular pliers, snips, a pair of vice grips, these large locking channel locks. These are brand new to me. Knipex plier wrenches, which are great. So the ones that I use all the time end up being on top most of the time, so I can grab them fairly quickly. Things that I don't use very often, very small pair of wire cutters, and there's an old zip tie in there, kind of get buried in the back, but that's because I don't use them very often. And again, when I'm done, I can literally just close the drawer and walk away. So the amount of time it takes to find a pair of pliers really isn't that bad. It doesn't look pretty. I can't quickly look at it and see that everything is there, that's for sure. So one way to lay out the pliers is what I call the square inch method. We're putting everything flat in the drawer. It's using up all of the square inches that are available in the drawer. Very easy to see, everything's laid out nicely. If you do the Kaizen foam, you have a very specific location for everything. So all of a sudden if you look, you see, oh wait a minute, there's something missing there. Like I say, nice layout. However, you're giving up, if this drawer, it doesn't matter if this drawer is 1 inch deep or if it's 12 inches deep, you're still going to get the same amount of pliers in here. So if you go back, think about the amount of pliers I had in the drawer here previously, well, here are the rest of them. I would have to put a complete another drawer to hold all these pliers, and as you can see, I still got some stacked. So if I wanted to have all of these, I would actually have to have a third drawer. Obviously, I could get rid of some of the junky pliers that I don't use very often, but that's not really the point. I have these pliers and I have them for a reason. So the square inch method works. Like I say, it doesn't necessarily use the whole drawer. Let's take a look at that. So the other way to set up the toolbox drawer is to look at it from the point of view of cubic inches. I want to set up these pliers in an organized fashion using as much of the depth of the drawer as I possibly can and still have a fairly decent organized approach. Getting more tools in one drawer rather than tying up 2 drawers like I showed before. So this is kind of the concept. These pliers are going to stand up on their side. They will all fit. They're all beneath the height of the toolbox drawer here. And as you can see, they're fairly organized. I'll be able to see what's what fairly quickly. There are 2 other, I'm going to delegate this area here for the rack, essentially. There will be some pliers that are either too tall or too long to fit in that orientation. So this side I'm going to leave available just to set these 2 large pliers I use fairly regularly. They'll set off to the side. And then the rest of the drawer will be delegated for areas for just some old junky pliers that I don't want to throw away, because every once in a while you want a pair of pliers that you need to beat up on or something like that. So those will be kind of scattered about, but my main good pliers will all be stacked up in the racks here nicely. Okay, for the design to accomplish this, I've made myself a couple of cardboard templates, and basically it's just a piece of, it's going to be sheet metal, piece of sheet metal with some return flanges bent over, and then tied together side by side. So basically, I tried some mocking this up in cardboard. It's kind of hard to do this well, but the small pliers fit, and then all the way up, even the larger pliers still fit in there fairly well. So that's kind of what I'm going to work off of. Again, just use some cardboard to get myself a quick idea, rough idea. I went through a couple of different iterations. This stuff, you can cut it up, throw, if it doesn't work, throw it in the recycling bin, and voila. All right, so now we're going to work on the building stage. I want to talk about a couple different things. First thing I'm going to talk about is sheet metal. So you can buy sheet metal in many different ways. You can go to the scrapyard and cut the sides off of washing machines if you want. You can go to a big box store and buy sheet steel that's maybe 2 foot by 3 foot, something like that. I actually went to my local metal supplier and bought 2 4x8 sheets, and that was the best value. And I knew I would use it eventually. So 18 gauge and 20 gauge. This is 20 gauge is what I'm working with today. It's thin enough to be able to cut with hand tools. If I was using with the 18 gauge, the hand tools are very difficult to work with. So this 20 is about the limit for me for using hand tools. And just as you can kind of see, the amount of strength that's in this 20 gauge is pretty good. It doesn't need much reinforcement. I can flex it, but this thing isn't going to fall apart by any means. So in this particular case, using 20 gauge, it's working quite well. So tools. I started out, I've kind of done an evolution. You've obviously seen my pattern. I've gone through, I started out with just using hand tools. Sheet metal shears, hand shears. I've got a small flanging tool. I don't know exactly what it's called. A couple other things, just scissors for cutting my cardboard. This is a small second cut file, so it's got a fairly fine tooth. It works real well. If you try to use like a mill bastard file on 20 gauge, it's so rough, it's difficult. Square, scribe. So we're going to get into this, a scribe versus a Sharpie, tape measure, dead blow, just to kind of straighten things out and dike them. Those are the hand tools I used. You see over here, and we'll get into it a little bit more shortly, is a bench shear. I've got one of these. I rarely use it because I don't do a lot of sheet metal. I broke that out after kind of struggling with the hand tools for a little bit. It's working much better. I originally bent the first set with just the flange tool here. And then I finally got out my 48-inch brake. So I've been doing the most recent ones with a brake. And I have a big, and I'll show it in a bit, a big 48-inch brake. You don't need that for this. If you've got a little benchtop brake, a 12-inch brake, you just need something long enough to fit these little things. The brake worked much better. So I basically did 2 key iterations. These ones I cut by hand with the hand tools. And I don't know how the view will be, but the edge is fairly rough versus these were cut on the bench shear, which is much smoother. The other thing is then the bending. The bending, I used the hand flange tool here, and you can see there's a pretty good size radius in there. Basically, I was grabbing onto it, hanging onto it, and then trying to, work against the table and flex it. And it's not a real crisp, sharp corner. So so this worked good. I mean, these really are not bad parts. However, they're just not consistent. So trying to get an equal, repeatable part is quite difficult. So I made 2 of these. I didn't end up welding them together. I made 2 with just hand tools, and it's possible. You can do that. You can do this with these tools right here. It's just going to be a little bit more labor intensive. If I were going to do that, I would go down even thinner on the material, maybe 22 gauge to make it even easier to bend. So that being said, I then started using the bench tools. So the bench shear and then the brake, and that made me a much more consistent part. The other thing to talk about is patterns. So patterns and marking. So my first patterns on these was a cardboard template that I had cut out, and I used a Sharpie to mark them. So you can take a Sharpie, if I can get that to pick up, and you know, a Sharpie is probably 3/32 of an inch wide, something like that. So trying to get a nice precise line up on that is difficult, whereas if you take a scribe, you can actually put a scribe mark in the middle of the Sharpie and get a much clearer defined line. So that helped quite a bit. I switched from the Sharpie to the scribe, which got me much closer and much more repeatable. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention is that the other thing I switched to was I had a cardboard pattern, and what I did is I made myself a steel pattern. And the key thing I did with this is I cut it, and then I made sure that these two edges were square. I took it over to the belt sander and kept working on it till these were good and square, because I'm going to mark up 3/4 of an inch for a bend line here and here, and if these two aren't square, the rest of my part's not going to be. This end, this top, and this top, if they're plus or minus, you know, I mean, probably 1/8 of an inch, you won't really notice the difference. So steel pattern worked out well. And I mentioned that I switched to a scribe instead of the Sharpie as a marking medium. I've done that for the bend lines. However, I'm still using the Sharpie as a marker for the cut lines. And the reason I'm doing that is with the sharp metal pattern, I can just cut to the inside edge of that line, so remove the line, and it works well. So it's just and it's a quicker way to work. So I will continue to do that. Oh, last thing, notice the P for pattern. If you're going to make a pattern, make sure you mark it, because once you start cutting out 15 of these things, they're going to be all over the place, and they should be very close, but if you use the same one over and over again, you're going to get more consistent results. P for pattern. So the real key to this is to get a really good eyeball on the blade and make sure that you are right in line with where you want to go before you start pulling that lever. Because once you do, there's not a lot of moving afterwards. This thing cuts very straight, and there's not a lot of turning. There are shears out there that will do that, but this one is not one of them. If you haven't seen one of these before or used one before, this is a 3M Scotch-Brite wheel. This is a 6" by 1". It's excellent for deburring things. If you're using sheet metal at all, it works great. Any sort of a broken edge you can deburr, and it makes a kind of a mirror finish on it. It's great. So basically I'm just going to do a quick lap around, take any of the burrs off from the belt sanding, and then I'll just run it right straight on there on the top edge, and it'll be butter smooth. You can run your hand right across it and there's no problem. So it works great. So like I say, I've got these nice sharp scribe lines here to look at, and try to get things down nice and even. Lock it down, bend it. I always try to go a little under and then sneak up on it so I don't overbend it, which I've been known to do more than once. All right, there we go. So the nice thing about the finger brake is now we've got an opening here. Lock it down. And voila. And overbend it just a touch. Pull it back. Boom, there we go. All right, now it's time for welding. So what we're doing, just trying to get all of these things spaced up. I want the flat base to be nice and flat so it sits flat. I want the back to be basically square. There's a little bit of a bow to it, but it's going to be in a toolbox. It's really not that big of a deal. First things first, this edge is, on this one we take a look, this edge is up a little bit. I just take the flange tool here, just give it a little bit of tweaking. Just keep working it until it's nice and flat on the table. This one happens to be one of the worst ones. There, that's pretty good. I've got a piece of 3/4 inch aluminum, 3/4 inch spacer, which does several things. One, it's a heat sink, so I'm not melting through this material quite so easily. Two, gives me a nice clamping block. So I just clamp that bad boy in there. Gives me spacer, clamping block, tap things down, tap them in, take a square, put it across the back, make sure it's looking good. All right. Tighten it up. There were, especially the first couple, were not perfectly sized, so there were some pretty good sized gaps, which I'll show you a close up later when I finish this up. So the aluminum, I could weld right up against it and it would fill the gap with no problem. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to get a handful of good tack welds in here. This doesn't need to be fully welded, it's going to warp bad enough as is. And then I come through with a grinder, grind it off, get it reasonably flush, move on. Next one, keep going. Every once in a while I take the aluminum block, dunk it into the water bucket just to cool it off. So let's have at it. Okay, to grind this, I'm using a brand new 36 grit flap wheel. The reason being is I want an aggressive wheel. With a sheet metal, it's pretty lightweight and it builds up heat quickly. So I want a real aggressive grit, which just kind of rips the high spots off fairly quickly, doesn't put a lot of heat into the product or to the part itself, and moves along pretty good. This is the completed assembly. As you can see, it's got a little bit of black spray paint on it. You can see if the light hits just right, you know, the welds are not anything spectacular, nothing to write home about. You can see some of the gaps that are in between. But again, really the welds are just some tacks to hold the thing together. It really is not going to be, you know, this thing is not going to take much abuse. Time for the big reveal. Ta-da! As you can see, it's not perfectly organized, but it kind of meets that 85th percentile I talked about in my other toolbox video. The vast majority of what I'm going to use is well organized, right on top, ready to go. I can get to things quickly. I can't do an inventory instantaneously, but I don't need to do that. The drawer or the little holders work pretty good. You can grab things out fairly quickly, put them back in pretty easily. Not as quick as the old method where you take something, when you're done with it, you just toss it on top. You got to focus a little bit more, but it really isn't bad. So I'm pleased with it. So that was a good little project done. I think I got the box quite a bit more organized. I'm pleased with that. We'll see how it works. Put it to use for a little while and give it a shot, see if they need to make any adjustments. Like I said before, this is something that I've seen done on YouTube or something similar. People use dish racks and just cut out the wire racks that aren't needed. So, you know, for probably $4, I could have done this in 20 minutes. But it wouldn't have given me a chance to use my sheet metal tools and practice something that I don't normally deal with. I don't do a lot of sheet metal work. Scott over at Defender Chassis is probably cringing at some of my sheet metal techniques, but at least I got some practice. I learned some things. I got to use some hand tools first, then it actually gave me a chance to get out some of my bench tools, the bench shear and the brake, which both really helped the quality of the project. So overall, I'm really pleased with how it worked. Please leave a comment. Give me a thumbs up if you liked this video. Thumbs down if you didn't, but if you didn't like it, please give me a comment. Let me know why. I appreciate it. And subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and thanks for coming into the workshop with me. And see you next time in RJ's workshop.